Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of FoodTech Innovation Podcast, brought to you by Icicle Technologies. I'm your host, Steven Burton, founder and CEO of Icicle. Thank you for joining us as we embark on this journey to explore the transformative impact of technology and learn about success stories in the world of food and beverage manufacturing. Each episode will cover a specific aspect of innovation and technology adoption, examining the implications for food safety, profitability, sustainability, and we're here to inform, inspire by showcasing the latest innovations and best practices that drive positive change. Before we dive into today's topic, I just wanted to share a little bit about my background and the inspiration behind Icicle Technologies. As a technologist with a background in manufacturing, I've seen firsthand the complexities and challenges that businesses face as they maintain high standards of safety and quality in the food industry. After suffering several bouts of serious foodborne illness myself, I decided to launch Icicle Technologies specifically to address these challenges and empower food businesses to thrive through automation, innovation, and efficiency. So in today's episode, I'd like to welcome Lavina Gully, who's the Regional Innovation Director with the Canadian Food Innovation Network. Lavina is here today to talk about innovation trends in Canada. Perhaps we could start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself and the Canadian Food Innovation Network and what your role is in it.
Sure. So CFIN, as we call ourselves for short, we're home to Canada's largest food innovation community. So we are a national member-based network. Our membership is on an individual basis and it's absolutely free. And we exist to stimulate innovation, but especially collaboration and a more connected industry across Canada. So in order to do that, we've developed an online platform that we call Yodel, which all of our members get free access to. And in it, you'll find an active discussion forum where our members can post questions, kind of look for resources, help each other out, share their expertise and experiences. We're over 5,000 members now across Canada, and you can browse all of the companies and people that belong and reach out to them. And we love seeing our members kind of connect with each other and potentially do projects and work together, because we also have grant funding that can be made available to people who are undertaking R&D projects. If you're a member and you're looking for more curated introductions, we also have a team of regional staff. So that's the role that I play. There's 5 of us kind of situated across the country, living and working in specific regions. And we're sort of the boots on the ground that our members can speak directly to us if they have some more specific needs around pathfinding or wayfinding. So yeah, we were established in 2021, so we're fairly new. I've been with CFIN for a couple of years now. And prior to joining, I was also on the food manufacturing side as a product developer for various brands and companies here in the Vancouver region. So hanging out my hairnet for a little bit and now kind of working in a kind of ecosystem support role.
Okay, fantastic. At least you don't have to wear a beard net like me.
True.
So with this wealth of experience that you kind of bring to the table here, what kind of common mistakes do you see a lot of businesses make, and how could they be avoided, particularly with respect to bringing new technologies to the market?
Yeah, I would say probably, that market validation piece is sometimes where innovators kind of go down the wrong path, maybe not knowing your customers well enough. I know for CFIN, for example, before we launched our Yodel platform, we conducted, focus groups across different groups of stakeholders to really understand what they were trying to achieve. And that kind of led us to creating the platform that we did. And so we're constantly now listening and continuing to iterate as we get feedback. So yeah, I think it's really critical if you are bringing new technology to really spend that time and effort up front to figure out kind of who your customer is and that your solution is actually something that they're really needing.
I know from our experience, sometimes we run into situations where companies are looking to adopt new technologies because they want to solve a particular problem, but they're so busy dealing with the problem that they don't necessarily have time to implement the solution. So sort of too busy putting out the fire to get the fire hose, so to speak. Do you find that as well?
I think so too. And that's something that kind of as we evolve, as CFIN evolves, we're looking to see how we can support more of the adoption side. I think since inception, we've been really focused on building those connections and those collaborations for the industry and also funding some of that upfront development work. But that's also something that is in our future, is to kind of provide more support on that technology adoption piece.
Okay. And what are some sort of weird or unusual things that people really don't know about innovation in the food and beverage industry?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, sometimes what's still a bit kind of unknown or unusual is just this, in general, this concept of food tech or food technology, or really what's considered innovative like in the food industry. So obviously there's new innovative foods that are created and launched for consumers that you see on shelf. But, we're trying to establish this definition of food tech that really covers things like robotics and automation and packaging and upcycling and, supply chain technology and, even e-commerce platforms and changing how consumers even access food. So these companies that I think develop these types of solutions have often been on the periphery of the food industry, if you will. So it's our hope that CFIN can bring some awareness to this slice of the sector, and that they can find within CFIN a hub and a home base to kind of meet other innovators who are also working on, that food technology.
Okay, great. And what's something sort of interesting that you've learned recently that was surprising to you?
Yeah, it's been a couple of years now that, CFIN has been in existence. And I think what still continues to surprise me is just the sheer number of food tech companies that do exist, here in Canada, and also just how large the food and beverage processing industry is. It's the largest manufacturing sector in Canada in terms of GDP and employment. And I think when I, first learned that, I was really surprised. I knew Canada had, very good and strong primary agriculture sector, but I didn't quite realize how big the kind of post-farm gate sector really is.
Yeah, I just arrived recently back from Australia myself, and I was pleased to find that the Canadian market seems to be quite far ahead of the Australians in terms of secondary manufacturing. Also, they're very big in primary, but very little secondary, and we have a nice mix up here. So
yeah,
excellent. So what would you say is the most significant technological advancement that's impacting the food and beverage industry now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, looking back at some of the kind of major pain points that have been facing the industry and consumers over the past, 5 to 10 years has kind of set the stage for what research has been done, and therefore what tech advancements we're kind of seeing progress today. And obviously one of the major crises, if you will, was COVID. And obviously during that time, food and beverage manufacturing and especially a lot of restaurants and hospitality faced like labor challenges. A lot of people who moved away from those jobs never returned back to those jobs. So stemming from that, I think we're seeing a lot more advancements now in things like robotics and automation. For example, there's a BC company called Cybotica. They're creating an automated make line for food service and quick service restaurants. So some of the tech hurdles that they've had to overcome is, how to deposit food and ingredients of different textures, like, depositing rice or leafy greens or avocado chunks. Actually, funny, I just saw an article last week where, some bank employees, I think down in the States, kind of went and ordered 75 of the same like burrito bowl from like a popular burrito bowl chain. And I think they, went across like 8 or 10 different restaurants. And there's huge variation in weight is what they noticed, right? They're ordering the same thing from the same restaurant across different locations, but there's this massive, variation that they're seeing. And obviously consumers, they want consistency, there's an impact to the company as well. So something like this kind of automated make line, I think is really quite needed and advanced. I think another major driver of course is, climate and the impact of conventional meat in the animal industry. So, what started as, veggie burgers and moved on to bleeding burgers has really taken a huge technical leap forward into this field of cellular agriculture and lab grown meat and precision fermentation. I think consumers, they can buy products now made from, milk protein that was made through, a fermentation lab. And, that technology itself can also be applied to like vanilla or even chocolate. And, interestingly enough, Canada actually has many companies working in this space across the country. There's like Ardra and Liven Proteins, Myopalette, Harvest Moon. There's quite a few. So yeah, I feel like those kind of like robotics, automation, even like cellular agriculture are just some examples of kind of where we've really tried to advance technology.
I'm probably going to shoot myself in the foot here because we have quite a few plant-based food companies, but I love meat personally, and the lab-grown meat really sort of piques my interest. I think that's a really viable option to moving away from meat entirely because it's just so good. Do you think it's going to be sort of on the horizon, like at the supermarket anytime soon, or do you think we're still quite a ways off from that?
We're probably still a ways away from seeing, a lab grown steak or something like that. I know there's a few countries that have made the news headlines because they have passed those regulatory hurdles, and we're seeing, hybrid products come onto market, like, chicken nuggets or something like that incorporate a certain percentage of these lab grown, animal cells. So I think we're going to see probably hybrid products hit the market, but I think it might be a little ways away before we're seeing, those steaks and things like that are, very, very close in approximation to the real thing. But, that's really the way that the industry is moving.
Are you a meat eater yourself?
I am. I'm sort of kind of, consume everything in moderation.
So would you take the plunge and eat some lab-grown meat if it was available?
Absolutely. I'm very curious. I've not myself been able to try any of that lab-grown or cellular meat products, but I'm absolutely be game.
Yeah, me too. I think it's going to be. I'm really looking forward to it. Actually, in my travels around all over the show, I found really it's mostly the discussion today is around artificial intelligence and sustainability. So on the sustainability side, what do you see happening, sort of playing out in the next little while?
Yeah, I think sustainability and eco-friendly practices are really going to drive a lot of innovation. Obviously, our population continues to grow. Food is something we can't live without. There's been a lot of innovation on the ag side. There's a huge focus right now on like regenerative agriculture. You're seeing a lot of technologies implemented at the farm level, which are meant to, improve water usage or, more precise use of like nutrients or fertilizers, or even the use of like drones, for example, to, map out the field and where water is needed. But I think there's innovation kind of throughout the value chain, even, post farm gate, all the way up to the consumer level. And I think within that kind of slice, there is a real focus on like resource efficiency and reduction of food waste and upcycling. So I think we're seeing a lot there. There's a good example is that there's a company in Summerland called Crush Dynamics. So they take waste from the wine industry, and through fermentation and some processing, they're able to kind of turn that waste into a unique food ingredient that has sodium and sugar reduction properties and even shelf life enhancement properties. So that's, I think, one area where we're seeing a lot of activity kind of in that valorization side of things. One of our CFIN members actually in Quebec, Tate Labs, the founder, he's actually created this really cool tool that can help companies quantify in dollars the value or the potential value of their food waste. And he's using antioxidant content as an indicator. But, it's a really interesting way to start to build that business plan for your company and potentially figure out, a new revenue stream. So doing this kind of really quick calculation using his tool, again, is, born out of an issue that somebody was seeing, and how do we help companies realize kind of some of that upcycling value. So yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of activity kind of in that food waste reduction and upcycling area.
That's interesting. When you first started mentioning upcycling, I was thinking more about kind of, restaurant food waste. And from a food safety perspective, that has me kind of concerned a little bit sometimes. Like they say in food safety that there's nothing that's forbidden, but, you just have to make sure it's safe. So there are ways to make it safe. But I really like the idea of that intermediate processing step, like taking the food waste there, because you're not having to deal necessarily with so much pathogen growth. and,
Exactly.
excuse the pun, but going through too many hands, during the manufacturing process. So that's great. So what do you see like the main drivers in terms of innovation happening in Canada right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've touched on a few of them, like, labor challenges or kind of the sustainability movement, but consumers, I think, actually, of course, drive a lot of innovation when it comes to like the food itself. I think health and wellness it's really no longer just a trend. Health and wellness, I think, is here to stay. It's always an ever-present kind of movement for which then you get maybe kind of smaller trends coming off of it, like, gut health, is a movement, or personalized nutrition. I think, consumers are driving the use of, for example, this interest in AI, right? AI to help people make better food choices. There's a couple companies in BC, Chronometer and Fresh Prep, so they're both looking at interesting projects on how to incorporate AI into their products to really help consumers make like better food choices. I think consumers are also demanding, more transparency and traceability when it comes to the origin of their food. That's driving some technologies and solutions like Index Biosystems is a company that has a yeast that almost acts as a barcode. So you can actually kind of apply this yeast seamlessly, invisibly, to raw ingredients like flours or grains. And, it's a way to then kind of track that traceability throughout, the food chain. This Fish is another local company here in BC that also has traceability solutions, in addition to some kind of vision technology for fish processing plants, again, addressing kind of that labor that we touched on. So yeah, I think while, consumers aren't the only driver of innovation, it is a group that is pretty effective at pushing industry towards continuous improvement and towards innovation.
You think that some manufacturers might not want very high visibility in terms of traceability, like they're able to obfuscate a little bit, perhaps, their ingredient sources or the content of their food? Or do you think they generally are pretty open to being transparent?
I think they do. I think most companies kind of take pride in being able to demonstrate, the sourcing partnerships that they have, or especially if they're involved in sustainable or fair trade practices or things like that. I think the companies that are going to lean into that and be able to kind of use that as a marketing tool are really going to see the benefit of it.
And the other thing that kind of occurs to me about that is that the food companies, like the food industry in general, is a very sort of mature market. They have razor thin margins. Do you think that consumers would be willing to pay extra for that?
That's a really good question. I think there is going to be a group of consumers who are willing to pay for that. How much? That's, the market is going to answer that question. But I do think that there is a subset of consumer who is really interested in that. And I think as you look at the different generations too, there is much more emphasis now on the company itself and the values of the company. I know the younger generation really value that. So the more companies can demonstrate their commitment and kind of their own values and put those on display, I think there is a shift towards that.
And being the expert on food innovation, like, do you see most companies kind of coming into the market, bringing new technologies to bear sort of on their own, or is it done mostly through sort of collaborations and partnerships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, this speaks to one of the big reasons why CFIN exists, which is to kind of foster that collaboration and partnership. I think it's, I think the importance of that could be understood a few different ways. I think one, especially, why they might want to partner with us, for example, is through, pooling like financial resources. I think is a huge benefit to some of that collaboration and partnerships, whether that's through a granting organization like us or through, investors that are helping you kind of really conduct larger, more ambitious projects. I think that's really important. I think we're seeing a lot of like resource sharing when collaborations and partnerships form. That diversity and bringing together different expertise and knowledge from different fields, combining, a partner who's strong in like science and technology, business or regulatory. I think that diversity and that kind of cross-discipline approach can really bring new perspectives or kind of a fresh approach to problem solving. And then, if you look at, for example, our Yodel platform, a lot of the questions we see are members looking for things like the right co-packing partner. And I think finding the right kind of partner collaborator there really impacts a company's ability to scale and that kind of speed to market. So that's that kind of search and that kind of the correct fit there is a very common ask that we see from our members and how they use our Yodel connector platform is to find, good co-packers to help them scale.
Yeah, kind of circling back on the AI question again, because that's one of our main focus. I just have AI in the brain generally right now, but I noticed that like one of my observations is when you look at kind of, sensor manufacturing companies or software companies or consulting companies, like it doesn't seem like any one company kind of has all the pieces that are required to kind of bring the technology to fruition. So I'm a big believer in collaborations as well. And finding partners is really, really hard. There's one particular device, for example, I've been looking for I think 5 years, and I haven't found a supplier that could supply it yet. So I appreciate what you're saying in that regard.
Yeah, maybe you should create a Yodel post for that. We'll see if we can get you some responses.
It's a portable and integratable probe sensor that can measure the internal temperature of foods. Hard to find. So in terms of the most promising areas kind of going forward in terms of integration, what are you seeing as like the low-hanging fruit in terms of that type of innovation?
Yeah, I think I might be a bit biased because of my product development background and all the years I've spent as a product developer, but I'm always really intrigued by new ingredients with novel functionality. Those always kind of catch my attention. I used to work a lot with textured vegetable proteins. So seeing kind of Canadian firms up and coming, like locally here, we've got Maya Farms. So they are developing like a textured mycelium protein. So that's really, really interesting and a very promising area, I think, of innovation. Inidol is, a Quebec-based company with a novel ingredient that controls pathogens. And then, of course, precision fermentation and creating ingredients that way is giving, product developers access to like a whole host of kind of novel ingredients that have that same structure and functionality as kind of the naturally sourced ingredients, but along with it have, that clean tech story that goes along with precision fermentation. So yeah, I think Canada has, again, a great reputation for the crops and the primary raw materials, but I think like you've touched on, we've come under criticism for, being a net exporter of those for that further processing and value add. So it's really, I think, good to see that there are a number of Canadian companies who are actively working on kind of creating those brand new ingredients right here in Canada, and then kind of building out their own customer base and using our food manufacturing industry as kind of like their first customers.
Yeah, we're seeing quite a bit of that in our client base as well. So I appreciate that. So taking out your crystal ball and kind of looking forward into the future, say the next 10 years or so, like what do you think the world food manufacturing is going to look like in 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested what you think too, because you've already mentioned, AI, for example. I'm sure that's going to play a role. For the consumer, it probably we're going to see as that AI gets incorporated, more of that kind of personalized component, whether it's personalized nutrition. We see, I think we're going to see that kind of health and wellness trend take on different forms. Perhaps, we've already heard that term like food is medicine, for example. But I think as we evolve and the food industry evolves, we're going to see companies who are developing, food for while you're on, a certain medical regimen. And I'm thinking specifically actually about, semaglutide or Ozempic. And food companies are recognizing that folks who are using this medication have specific nutrition needs, right? And especially if you're dealing with kind of decreased or suppressed appetite, how do you deliver and create food products for this larger group of people who are on this medication? How do you create, foods that address their specific nutritional needs when you're maybe not consuming as much I think we're also going to see food perhaps as a means of what happens when you want to get off that medication. There's been articles and, companies like Nestle, for example, have been looking at developing products that are going to be suitable because I think there's this fear. It's like, once you're off that type of medication, what's going to happen is, how can you maintain perhaps the healthy lifestyle and the blood sugar control? So I do think we're going to see kind of more products like that come out onto the market. I think the snacking industry is going to also have to respond. So that's, I think, kind of maybe consumer focused things that we might see as the industry evolves. For industry itself, I think we're going to see more focus on like data and digitization. I think some companies right now may not fully understand how to implement AI or how it could benefit from them. But I think at a minimum, all of this kind of talk is probably resulting in them revisiting their data, how they're collecting it, what they're collecting it. Because if they're not, focused on digitization and data, they might miss out on, how to really implement AI and things like that going forward. I don't know if that's kind of what you see as well, but
yeah, it's funny. I've been going around giving talks about AI. In fact, I have one with Food and Beverage Ontario tomorrow. But what I really noticed about that is that there's like tremendous opportunities. There's the enormous amount of benefit that can be brought to the table because it has so much in terms of particularly labor savings and quality control and safety improvements and lower maintenance costs. Like, it's great across the board, but there's very limited understanding about what it is. And a lot of people really kind of confuse the notion of going digital with artificial intelligence. They don't really understand the difference. So that's like one big distinction I make. And going digital is kind of a prerequisite to fully implementing AI. So what that means is that, you have to stop writing anything down on paper. Every letter that you write at a piece of paper is a waste of data. So you have to start to get it into something digital. It doesn't really even matter what so much. If it's Excel or Word, you can still work with it later. Obviously, a more comprehensive system is better, but that's what I tell people as a first step. But I think it's going to be huge. It's already huge, and it's going to get much bigger. Like, to give you one simple example, I was down in Oklahoma a couple of months ago, and I was at the facility, and I was watching the production line. I got a tour of the facility, and they're making a particular product, and they had one person operating the machine and 4 people standing there doing quality control checks at the other, as the product's coming out the other end, all of whom could have easily been replaced by artificial intelligence and sensors. Not that I'm advocating to replace employees with machines, across the board, but they could have been doing something a lot more useful and productive rather than just, checking something that could easily be checked by automation anyway.
Yeah,
So
especially if they're standing with a clipboard in hand. I've definitely spent my fair share of time in production environments. Yes, that were still very like pen, paper, clipboards.
Yeah, these guys were like measuring sausages and holding it up to the lid, kind of stuff like that. So actually manipulating the product. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. And I agree with you about lab-grown meat. I think that's something that probably is in the next 10 years going to come down the pike. And I think it's going to be tremendous from an environmental perspective as well. Yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would just probably say for, if there's folks out there who are innovators, and wanting to make an impact, just to understand that you're not alone. There's actually a vast ecosystem that exists of, innovation hubs and accelerators and incubators. There's a lot of business coaching, advisory services. So yeah, there's a lot of help out there. If you're undertaking the entrepreneurial journey, whether it's to understand raising capital or how to apply for grants or how to protect your IP or exporting or getting on some trade missions. So yeah, and if you're not finding what you need locally, then expand your search. And I think that's why CFIN and our network is so valuable. I think that's why, our regional innovation directors who can work with people and bridge that gap and make introductions across the country is really kind of why we exist and, part of how we want to stimulate innovation across our country.
So how can you find CFIN?
Yeah, so the best place is probably just to head to our website, which is cfin-rcia.ca. Click on the Join Now button, and that'll take you directly to our membership sign-up page. You can also connect with me personally on LinkedIn at Lavina Gully. Send me a connection request, and I'd be more than happy to direct you.
Okay, and for those of you that don't have photographic memories, we'll post the links in the video below. Well, I think you guys are doing a wonderful job in general, and I think you particularly were a wonderful guest today, and I really want to thank you for coming on the show.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks for tuning into the FoodTech Innovators Podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion informative and inspiring. If you have any specific topics or questions you'd like us to cover in future episodes, feel free to reach out through social media or email info@icicletechnologies.com. Thanks again, and see you at the next episode of the FoodTech Innovators Podcast.